Hello, this is Jared from Commit Quality, and in this video we're going to go through working with locators and selectors in Playwright Test. First of all, what are locators? Locators are a way to find an element or elements on the given page at any moment. Built into Playwright, they have auto-weighting and retriability straight out of the box, so that gives you confidence in having these kind of resilient tests. And once you define a locator, you're then able to perform actions on that element. For example, a text box, you might want to fill in some text, or on a button, you might want to click a button, all that kind of thing. So to create a locator then, you need to choose what selector you want to use. For example, it could be CSS, XPath, we can use text values. There are best practices for choosing selectors, which we will get into in a few moments at the end of the video. But I'll put a link in the description now where you can go and have a look at the documentation for the best practices. Okay, jumping into this then, I should say I'm not going to go through XPath because I don't recommend using XPath to anyone because it's extremely flaky, it's not resilient, and it's not the right way to go about it. Because if you're using a long XPath, any small change in your DOM could cause your test to fail. So we always want to go for the more resilient and reliable selectors. So we're going to go over CSS and using text values and attributes. So we're going to use the computer database, and we're going to be interacting with this text box and this button and maybe some more things as well. So if you don't know how to find the attributes you might want to use, you can right click in Chrome and say inspect, and this will pop up your elements in your DOM here. And what we can do is if you click this button, you can see select an element in the page to inspect it, and you can hover over and you can see it and then click on it and it'll take you to that part of where it lives in the DOM. And when we talk about attributes, we're talking about things like these. So type is an attribute, ID, value, the class. You'll have different attributes for different things. So you can see on the text box, we have the ID, but we have a name, we have a placeholder because this is a text box, and the placeholder is what the user is seeing here. So let's jump into the actual code, start writing it up, and you can see how you can access these different attributes, and you can choose by text, CSS, all that good stuff. Inside Visual Studio Code, all I've done at the moment is create a new test, and I'm saying go to the computer database website, and I've added a page.pause in here. Now you could add breakpoints and use the VS Code extension, but I'm just going to use page.pause to stop the execution so we can kind of step over and we can see what's actually going on when we define and action our locators. First of all then, let's jump into finding something by an ID. So I'm going to go back to the computer database page, and we'll say we want to find the ID of this text box. And this would be the same as if I was finding the ID of this button. It doesn't really matter as long as it has an ID attribute associated with it. So in this case, we have ID equals search box. So I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to go back into my VS Code, and I'm going to say after the breakpoint, await page.locator, and this is saying I want to create a locator. And what we can see is this locator takes in one parameter called selector, and this selector will be whatever the ID was. So in CSS, IDs are defined by a hash. So we can say hash, and then I'll paste in the value I had. So this is saying find me a locator which has the ID of search box. We can add extra options saying like has this one mandatory parameter added in there. What we'll do is, because it's a text box, we'll have the action of fill, and we'll say fill it with hello. Great. So we've just actually created our first locator here, and we're actioning it by saying I found it and now I want to do something with it. And in this case, I want to say hello and enter hello into the text box. So let's run this. Once again, you can use the VS Code extension, but I'm going to do it via command line. And it'll be npx playwright test. I'm going to have it in headed mode just so we can see it's going there, but it'll also pause at this point so we can step over and we can see it finding the locator and action in it. It's not found. npx. Oh, I spelled playwright wrong. npx playwright test. There we go. Let's just wait for that to load up. Let's drag that over there. Okay, cool. So what we can see is gone to the computer database website. It's hit our page.pause, which is essentially a breakpoint. I'm going to step over this now. So it's going to look for the locator, which it has. It's found it, because you can see it's highlighted and search box. And if I now step over again, it should perform the fill action. So we should say, I found the locator, and now I want to perform an action on it. And we should see hello entered into here. Awesome, perfect. So there we are. That's the first example. That's your first locator created using the CSS ID value. Now, I should say, by best practice, you should only have one ID per element on a page. But what if we wanted to find by class? And in CSS, classes can be used for a number of different elements, which then makes it hard to find because you could be finding multiple elements. Now, in my future video, I'm going to talk about multiple elements, but for now, let's go to the computer database website. And I think I saw it here, where we have a class name here, button primary. Let's just double check that. Okay, so here we have a class of button, and then there's also, I don't know if you can see it on here, let's dock this down the bottom to make it a little bit more readable. It's a class of button, and then a spacer primary. So what this is saying is essentially two classes, one with button and one with primary. And if I do a quick Control F in here, we can see there's only one class in here that has button and primary. So we can take both of these. And to do this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, we know that one was great, so let's comment that one. Find by ID. In this case, I want to say find by class or multiple classes. So same again, await page.locator. In CSS, a class is defined with a full stop, a dot. So I'm going to say dot, and what was it? We had button as btn, and then we had space primary. So what we say is button, and then because it's another class, we say, because the space acts as another class, we say dot again, and we'll say primary, if I could spell. So this is going to say look for the locator, or the element, which has an attribute of class of button, and has the class of primary. So we can say, because it's a button, dot click. And once again, we should see that's how it's performed. So let's move this page dot pause here, because we know this one worked. Let's rerun the test. Okay, great. So that's loaded, and we can see that the search box has worked fine. We tested that last time. So I'm going to step over this again now. And what we should see, it's finding button and primary, the two classes. It's found it by filter by name, and if I say click, we should see now this has tried to filter. Step over it, there we are, clicked it, and nothing to display because there's no computer called hello. Fantastic, so that's working exactly as we expected. So that's how you can find IDs and classes, which are built into CSS. Now, I also want to show you how you can find attributes. So we talked about all these being attributes, so type, ID, value, class. So what if I want to find or use this text box by the attribute of name? We can do that as well. So I'm going to actually copy this because it's going to make my life a little bit easier. Now, we're already doing a fill here, so I'll add a find by attribute. In this case, it's going to be the name attribute. So once again, await page.locator. And for attributes, you open up square brackets, or well, you have the single quotes first, open up the square brackets, and inside here is the full attribute name, key, and value. So you've got name equals F, exactly how you're seeing it in the DOM here, name equals F. And what this will say now is find me that text box, and I'm going to say dot fill, and I'll say goodbye in this case. I'm going to comment out this ID one for now because I don't want it filling in both. But at this point, we're going to say find the text box with the attribute name equals F and fill in the text of goodbye. So, well, we can add a pause because we know it's going to find it there. We'll just stop it at that point just so you can actually see it's entered goodbye now instead. Fantastic, so that ran, and you can see goodbye has been entered into the correct text box, and it's actually using the name attribute to do that. So I can continue this through. We know it's going to click it and search, and I'll pass because there's no actual assertions on here. Okay, so that's a little way of how you can deal with kind of attributes, you know, the classes, the IDs. But how about finding by text, which is actually, one of the kind of better practices. And the reason why this is said is because you should always kind of prioritize user-facing attributes, things that the user can see, can interact with, assuming they're not likely to change on a regular basis. I think we can pick on the button for this one. So we got filter by name. We'll do that one instead because that's a good one to add in. So we can keep this in here. We'll comment this one out because this is the button. But in this case, we're going to say find by text. And this is a good way of asserting that the text has exactly what it should have, providing it doesn't change a lot. So I can say await page dot locator again. And in this case, I can say text equals double quotes, and we want the text of what it is. So it's filter, no, that's not that one. It's filter by computer name. So I can say, let's go to that. Filter by computer name. It lets me take it. Great. Put that in here, and we can say dot click on this one. And let's run that and see what happens. So we're just saying, find me something on the page that has the text of filter by name. And because that's the only text on the page, it'll be all fine to work. So let's say, run that test. Awesome. So this is up. Let's step over the pause. And now look, it's highlighted and it's showing, look, I found filter by name. Step over it, it clicks it. Fantastic, all works as expected. Now, one thing I do want to touch on is strictly searching by the text using these double quotes, or what you can also do is type it like this, and it doesn't matter about the casing then. So with the double quotes, let's add those back in a second just to show you what I mean with this. So we've got text filter by name. Now, if I add a capital I, what's going to happen, this is going to completely fall over because we are saying, I want to search for the text, filter by name, and it has to be the exact casing that we see in on the value of the web page. So if I run this, what's going to happen when I step over it is it's going to say, I don't know what this is, I can't find it. Okay, so that's loaded. Let's step over it. And now it's waiting for selector text equals filter by name, and it's going to keep looking until whatever my timeout is. And that's because we have a capital I in here. So I'm going to close this down because we know that's not finding it because it would have found it by this point. What I'm going to do now is remove these double quotes where you've got text equals. So now it's just text equals filter by name. And what you're going to see is it's just going to look for any text no matter what the casing is. So let's rerun this again. And what we expect now is it for to find the locator and click it because we haven't said we want it to be strict. Okay, awesome. So it's paused the page at this point. Now, because we've removed the double quotes making it strict, when I step over it, we should see it's found it. Even though we have the capital I there, it doesn't care about the casing. And you can step over it, and there we are. It's clicked it again. So that's a way of finding just by pure text values. And it's good to know that you can kind of do these strict searches as well, especially if you really do care about the casing of what you're seeing in your values, and you want to make sure that all that is working as expected. Now, another best practice is finding your text boxes by placeholders, assuming that they stay the same and they're obviously reliable to use. So in this case, it'll be the same. We can say find it by the attribute of placeholder, and then we can say copy all this as well. So if I copy this value here, or the actual attribute, let's go back to our tests. And we can keep this clicking in because that's all okay. We'll add another one here, which is find by placeholder, which essentially is the same as finding by attribute. You're just using a user-facing one instead. And we can say await page.locator. And if you remember what we said, we target attributes using the square brackets, and then I can paste in whatever the placeholder attribute was here. So placeholder equals and then the text that the user is going to see. And we can say fill, and we'll say using placeholder. So instead of just using it by a random attribute or the ID or class, you're actually using it by something that the user should see from inside the placeholder. So let's comment this one out and let's make those a little bit tight. Let's now run this. And what we should see is it's entered the text of using a placeholder because we've just got it from the placeholder attribute. Okay, so that's loaded here. And what we can see is if we step over, it's found the placeholder here. Click it again to action the fill, and there we are using placeholder, and it's going to do the clicks that we had in there already. So perfect. So we've just gone through how to use by text, how to find placeholder, find by ID, class, and find it by any attribute. I do also want to touch on locator options, which is when we hovered over this, we talked about using a selector, but there's also these options where you can say has and has text. So let's go over an example of doing that. Let's do it by, let's have a look on the front end. Filter by name. So we could say use the ID value, and then we'll also want to say we want to make sure this ID value has the text of this. So where we're talking about like classes having multiple classes on your different elements, you could say find this class but make sure it has a text of filter by name or something else, and that's a way of narrowing things down as well. But for this example, let's use the ID and then we'll say by the name as well. So let's go back into this, and we'll put it below this one and we'll comment this one out. And now I want to say find by ID and has text of whatever the string would be, which I think it was filter by name. Great. So once again, await page.locator, and we're going to say find the ID value, which I can't remember if I copied or not. It's search submit. So we'll say hash for an ID value. Okay, so we have that. And now what I can say is after this, I want to add an option of has text. And has text will take through whatever the text of that was. So it was filter by name. So let's copy that. Here, filter by name. And then after this, I'm going to do the click as we always do to make sure it gets clicked. So in this case now, what we're saying is find by the ID value and make sure that it has the text of filter by name. So let's run this and see if this has worked. Okay, so we got our pause. That was okay, so it's just filling in on there, so we don't worry about that. And what you can see, I stepped over it quite quickly then. But what happens, it found the locator using, look, their ID, and then it's saying has text of filter by name. So it's found it, and it even clicked it for us as well. So we can continue through that, and that's all worked as expected. Brilliant. So we've just gone through finding by text, placeholder, ID, class, any attribute, and using locator options to say find by ID and has the text of filter by name. Now, I want to go through the best practices. We touched on these a little bit as we were going through our code, but if I open up the web page, I already have the best practices open, which I'll put in a link into the description. But right here, the best practices always state it's best to prioritize user-facing attributes, such as the text of a button, the placer of a text box, just exactly how we've just shown in our examples. These are always going to be best used when you expect them to rarely change. So if you're expecting some kind of dynamic content to appear in a text box, you're not going to want to use user-facing attributes or the text of that, at least at the very least, because it's going to become flaky. Now, they do give a kind of order, so they say prioritize these, but it also says to state and define explicit contract. So what it's saying here is use things like test IDs, test ID attributes, and these are supported by the CSS and ID selectors as well, so you could pick those up. It's a perfect example here, like you would with a normal attribute. You can say, attribute data test ID equals directions, and you're all good to go with that. One thing I really want to touch on, which is why I didn't show you, using XPath or using long CSS structures, is because if the DOM is to change, you're going to cause your test to be really flaky, and it's going to add more maintenance. And the whole point of having kind of, automated tests is for them to, be resilient, reliable, and also be pretty good for maintenance. And you don't want to have a heavy maintained test pack because it's just going to cause more and more problems as more and more changes are introduced. So you might actually have spotted here as well. They talk about locator.end.first and locator.last. Now I'm going to be covering these off in the next locator video I do, and this is going to show how we can deal with multiple web elements, and we can see how we can use these. Now they do stay here, it's not always great to use, but there's going to be times where you might need to use them, and we'll go through that. As always, please drop a comment if you have any questions or you want anything clarified, and a subscribe to the channel is always greatly appreciated. As always, thanks for watching. Have a good day.